So welcome to the stage, Andrew Nutt. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm going to continue the theme of global crises and much of what Mark spoke about, starting with the happy topic of mass extinction events. And of course, we are currently living through the 6 mass extinction events since fossil records began some 540 million years ago. There have been 5 of these events previously. They're defined as events during which the majority of all living species are wiped out, and we're on track to achieve that, unfortunately, within just a few human lifetimes. The rate of extinctions was documented within a Science Advances study recently, in which scientists looked at the background rate of extinctions in the fossil record. And they noted that amongst vertebrate species, 9 extinctions would normally be expected to have occurred since 1900. However, there were conservatively number 468 extinctions that had occurred across the various taxonomic vertebrate groups. They said that depending upon the group, extinction rates were between 10 to more than 100 times higher than normal, and so the 6th mass extinction event is beginning, and they said that it would grow to a rival the last great catastrophe when the dinosaurs and much else died out, and there was 3 human lifetimes. So Mark was talking about global crises. My view is that this is the biggest global crises of our time, and also the generations that will come after us. It's hard to think of any greater tragedy, I think, than the wholesale destruction of the other species with whom we share the Earth, which is of course compounded by the fact that it's very much a tragedy of our own making. The study considered the kill mechanisms of habitat loss, predation, pollution and so on, and actually didn't factor in the effects of global warming and ocean acidification. The authors said we're living through one of those briefer episodes when the biological framework of life is being dismantled. So the causes of this, as you can see, are these. Habitat destruction and deforestation is probably the leading one. And the contributions of the livestock sector to this problem are very great. Livestock production occupies about 30% of the Earth's land surface. And as you can see, increasing production is a key driver of deforestation, particularly in Latin America, where 70% of previously forested Amazonian land is now occupied by pastures, with feed crops covering a large part of the remainder. Professor Philip Limbury has published a series of books about this and related problems. In his book Dead Zone, he describes travelling around regions of the world where many of the iconic animal species have resided, to document the decline of those species and look at the conditions that are causing those declines. He describes in his book flying over hundreds of kilometres of previously forested Amazonian rainforest, seeing just monocultures of soya crops and other feed crops where there used to be Amazonian rainforest. And those feed crops are being primarily grown to feed to beef cattle, which are primarily being produced to effectively produce hamburgers, usually for consumption by North American people, not even by the local people, unfortunately. So the Amazonian rainforest is the greatest rainforest on Earth. It's the most biodiverse ecosystem, and it produces a significant part of the world's oxygen as well. So the destruction of this is a tragedy that's virtually unparalleled in history. I used many of the slides from the World Alliance of Scientists, and some of their slides here are showing the rate of destruction of the Amazonian rainforest, more than 1 million hectares per year, and the increase in global tree cover generally. And you can see the rates in recent times have been rising, unfortunately. The primary cause of this deforestation is cropland expansion. Of course, large amounts of this cropland are not being used to grow feed crops, food for people, but rather feed crops for livestock animals, actually. And then livestock grazing contributes another 39% of this deforestation. So collectively, the livestock sector is certainly one of the major drivers of deforestation on the planet. We also have factors like urban sprawl, pollution, the collapse of oceanic fisheries caused by overfishing, which is accelerating around the world. And the big one, of course, apart from all that, is climate change. So those authors concluded that the networks of ecosystems and metasystems that comprise life on Earth are deteriorating. As a consequence, climate change coupled with fragmentation of habitats and rapid extinction of species are creating a spiral of feedback that's more likely to exacerbate and accelerate the problem. Sometimes when we get fragmentations of habitats, you get populations of animals that are cut off from one another, which decreases their genetic diversity and their ability to withstand challenges. They might be disease challenges or environmental challenges, which can result in further decline of those populations, further decreasing the genetic diversity, resulting in an extinction vortex. They refer to the Anthropocene, the current geological age, a period in which human activity is the dominant influence on climate and the environment. This is being exacerbated by positive feedback mechanisms, and you'll be aware of some of these. We have the melting of the Arctic tundra with collapse of land in some regions of the far north, resulting in the release of vast amounts of methane gas, which have been trapped in that permafrost land into the atmosphere, which is, of course, powerful greenhouse warming gas. Methane is about 72 times more damaging than CO2 over a 20-year time frame in terms of its global warming potential. This is Lake Baikal in the Soviet Union. It's the world's largest, deepest, oldest freshwater lake, and it contains about 20% of the world's fresh water. And it gets so cold there that sometimes the water just freezes completely. And because it is so clear, it's fresh water, in this particular picture, it's actually trapped. The bubbles of methane gas are bubbling up from the surface of the lake, and that's going on across all of the frozen north, releasing literally gigatons of methane gas into the atmosphere. We know about the melting of the polar ice, and obviously, as you can see there, turning the surface from a lovely white reflective layer, reflecting solar radiation, to this dark oceanic water layer, which absorbs heat much more easily. Charts are clearly showing the reduction of sea ice over time, and also land ice masses as well, which is a big concern because that, of course, raises sea levels. We're currently warming at a rate of 0.2 degrees per decade. Mark spoke about the 1.4 something degree increase in global temperatures in the last calendar year, but in the 12 months ending in May, that's just passed, the global average surface temperatures was 1.6 degrees, actually above historical levels. So we've actually already exceeded 1.5 degrees that the Paris Climate Change Accord told us was so vital not to breach in order to not trigger tipping mechanisms and runaway positive feedback mechanisms exacerbating climate change. Of course, that's not a sustained increase, but we're certainly on track to achieve a sustained reach of the 1.5 degree target, unfortunately. You can see various models for the expected rise in global average surface temperatures on the left-hand side, up all the way up to near 5 degrees in worst case scenarios. And as you can see, global surface temperature rises are not uniform around the world. They're rising much more quickly in the Arctic because of that melting sea ice. This is having various effects on animals. Just some random examples here. I'm from Australia originally, so I'm very concerned about koalas. Koala populations are under significant threat anyway because of habitat declines and disease, but they're also very limited in which kinds of eucalypt leaves they can eat. They can only eat leaves from certain species of eucalypts. They have pretty marginal calorie intakes anyway. Unfortunately, some of those eucalypt leaves are becoming toxic to koalas because of high CO2 concentrations, so further placing those populations under threat. Animals are changing their geographic ranges because of climate change. You can see they are moving closer toward the poles and climbing higher in the mountains, but at some point, of course, they're going to run out of mountains. Climate change, it must be recognised, doesn't adversely impact all animals. There are some animals that benefit from climate change. Bark beetles, for example, are spreading across the Pacific northwest forests in North America, ravaging those forests as they go, so they're doing well, unfortunately. And in general, the more adaptable species, the greater its survival chances, and this applies to other contexts as well. The ubiquitous cockroach, for example, is a species that's expected to survive virtually nuclear wars, but species like that may well survive climate impacts as well. I don't just love koalas, being Australian, I love coral reefs as well. And I spent far too many hours actually body surfing and snorkeling when I should have been studying for my high school examinations. It's a miracle that I somehow managed to pass all that and stand before you today. Another miracle occurred in 2010 when I somehow acquired a PhD from Griffith University in Queensland. And when heading back to collect that, I took a side trip here to Hardy Reef on the outer Great Barrier Reef. And, Great Barrier Reef is the greatest coral reef on Earth, of course. These are my own photos, that's me in the top middle. And I recall seeing inquisitive sharks, majestic stingrays, coral polyps the size of small motor cars, and it was all absolutely beautiful. And I love coral reefs. They're the most biodiverse marine ecosystems. They're home to about 1 to 3 million species and a quarter of all marine fish species. They're literally the rainforests of the sea. So, I'm particularly worried about this. Most of the global warming that's occurring is unfortunately going into the oceans. And this is driven, of course, by increasing atmospheric CO2 levels and other greenhouse gases. And this chart shows just how dramatically fast those levels are rising. This looks at the levels going back nearly 1 million years. And you can see the current levels, not even 409. We're actually way above the top of that chart at the moment. That comes from a few years back. Every time I give this presentation, I check the current levels. This is way out of date. We're now 427 parts per million, unfortunately, as of today. So the levels just keep going up and up. And during the previous million years, of course, there have been a whole bunch of ice ages and meltings, and we're well beyond the levels that triggered those sorts of events in the past. As CO2 levels rise and the oceans in particular warm, we have the destruction, unfortunately, of the world's coral reefs well underway. Well over 30% of the world's coral reefs have already been destroyed. We're on target to achieve 60% before the end of this decade, unfortunately, in the destruction of virtually all of them, particularly those in shallow seas, by the end of this century. It's been estimated that CO2 levels of 350 parts per million would still result in widespread destruction of the coral reefs, and of course we're at 427 as of today and rising fast. So the destruction is occurring, resulting in bleaching of reefs. This is going on all across the Great Barrier Reef and other shallow water reefs around the world. Bleaching of reefs that's caused by certainly the pollution, overfishing, the spread of disease and invasive alien species such as the crowned fallen starfish, but most of all by global warming and particularly oceanic warming, which kills the fragile unicellular algae which reside inside coral polyps, giving them their beautiful colours. And as they die, you get this bleached effect. So if, like me, you love coral reefs, then go and see them soon, and ideally in a climate-friendly way of travelling, and enjoy them while they last, because sadly they're going. Many of you will have seen pictures like these, or been to places where glaciers are also eroding around the world, or melting away, I should say. These are my own photos here. So in France, there's around about 30 glaciers in the French Alps, and the largest is the Mer de Glace, the Sea of Ice. Where the ice level used to be is indicated by the red arrow, and that's about 200 metres higher than the current level of the ice. And just to show the scale of this picture, the bit in the circle there is actually this. These are giant flutes of ice that are rising up in the corner of that glacier as it makes a turn around the shoulder of the mountain. They're so big that you can do ice climbing. They're the size of houses. This is me actually. I did a mountaineering course for dummies, as it were, to try to climb Mont Blanc some years ago. I was attempting to climb this ice wall. That's me in the middle, I stayed in a climbers hostel with the guy on the right, who's from a Russian mountaineering club. This was about a decade ago, and his girlfriend had threatened to do horrible things to him if he ever went down the Valley Blanche again on his own. And I'm going to show you what the Valley Blanche is shortly. And accordingly, he invited me to come along with him. And the French guy on the left there would love to go down the Valley Blanche, he decided, without having to pay for a guide, so he somehow inserted himself in our little group. So the three of us found ourselves the next morning here. This is the northeast ridge of Aiguille du Midi, the middle of the north. And this is how you get to the start of the Valley Blanche ski run, which is indicated, it's just over there actually. But in order to get there, you have to descend this ridge, which we duly did. It's quite exciting because you tend to be roped to your companions, so if any one of you falls, then you'll all fall, which means you'll never fall alone, at least. If you fall to the right, you'll go about 200 metres down and disappear into the small crevasses. If you go to the left, thankfully there's no crevasses, but just below the edge of the picture here, things go vertical for about 6,000 feet, and you'll end up in Chamonix Township. So I used to have a coffee to wake myself up in the morning, but I tell you, this is way better than any coffee, any brand you'll ever have. It snaps you wide awake first thing in the morning. So if you survive that, you end up here, and then you actually ski down the Valley Blanche, the White Valley, which is down a series of about 2 major glaciers and a drop of 3,000 metres, and you eventually emerge where the train station used to be. This is the longest off-piste ski run in the Alps. And as we skied down the Valley Blanche, I started to see this all over the glaciers. There's this beautiful blue water appearing on the glaciers, and of course it was very beautiful, but sadly it indicated the glaciers are actually melting. And this became the Mer de Glace, the biggest glacier in the French Alps, which is the first photograph that I showed you. That's what we skied out on. Here there's a bunch of people skiing off the main path on the right-hand side, because on the left someone's been rescued from a crevasse that they've fallen into, because the ice bridges over the crevasses were thinning as well because of all this melting. That happens all the time. It's a fairly routine thing out there along the Valley Blanche. When you eventually get to the end, a generation ago you would have been up there where the train station is, but every 10 years or so they actually have to build another set of stairs, which now goes in this rickety fashion all the way down to the current ice level. And it's thought the entire glacier, this biggest glacier in the French Alps, will be gone within another generation. Because of all this melting of glaciers, and in particular ice caps in places like Greenland, the Antarctic ice sheets, the sea levels are rising. Worst case projections estimate sea level rises of up to 80 feet within about 300 years, which of course would completely alter the geography of places like Great Britain and Ireland, and drown coastal cities such as New York and London. It's not a coastal city, but of course would be affected. More conservative estimations talk about the expected melting of just the Greenland and Western Antarctic ice sheets, so not the Eastern Antarctic ice sheet, for example, combined with thermal expansions of the ocean, could raise sea levels by up to 6 feet. But even rises of just half that would devastate the rice-growing deltas and floodplains of Asia, and there are hundreds of millions of people that depend on those for food. Likewise, the Himalayan and Tibetan glaciers, unfortunately, are also rapidly melting. They actually sustain the major rivers in India and China during the dry season, and the grain irrigation systems that depend on these. The vast populations dependent on these glaciers make this melting the greatest threat to food security that's ever been faced by humanity. This isn't just an animal welfare issue. On top of that, we have the population problem. We are currently 8.1 billion individuals. That also seems to go up every time I get this talk and check it. We're on target to be a little bit under 10 billion by the middle of the century, and above that by 2070. So demand for food is going up. On top of that, we have decreased productivity of our agricultural systems because of increased extreme weather events such as droughts and floods. And indeed, in the United Kingdom recently, we've had this unseasonally extended wet period, which has actually affected our agricultural production, and there's actually been increase in prices in supermarkets of certain products because of that. Globally, you can see what's happened in the past. The prices of sugar, corn and wheat are triggered by severe weather events as well, which are becoming more common with climate change. This is making some of these products less affordable by the poorest people in the world. We already have inequitable distribution of grain around the world, with the current per capita projections varying from over 96 kilograms per person in the wealthiest nations down to just under 30 kilograms per person in developing countries. So a massive inequitable situation already. And that's because in developed nations, people don't consume most of that grain directly. They consume it indirectly in the form of livestock, animals and their produce. Farmed animals consume, as you can see, at least 6 to 12.5 kilograms of plant protein to produce a single kilogram of animal protein. So they consume the lion's share of all that grain, actually. And that's indicated by this chart here. You can see that global soy production is mostly not consumed by people, which is the green part. They're mostly consumed actually by farmed animals. This is highly inefficient as a way to produce food. And this is demonstrated by the proportion of agricultural land that's consumed by livestock, whether to grow feed crops, to feed to livestock animals, or to graze livestock animals on pasture. And 83% of global agricultural land is used for livestock. That in turn produces 18% of the calories that we consume and 37% of the protein. So it's an incredibly inefficient way of actually producing food to feed us. The result of all this essentially waste of the food that we produce is waste during the conversion process, is that there's not enough to go around really for the people least able to afford grain. So we actually produce enough food to feed double the current human population of the earth, and yet 1 in every 9 people, or 821 million people by 2017, actually suffers from hunger and malnutrition because they just can't afford this grain because of overconsumption in wealthy nations. If we were all to consume the meat-rich diets of the 20th most industrialised nations, we'd need seven planet Earths to produce the amount of grain that would require. So, in the last few months, some colleagues and I actually published a systematic review searching for all solutions to combat climate change that have been described within the scientific literature in the last 20 years. So we searched 8 scientific literature databases, the main databases and some minor ones as well. We identified many initial studies that appeared relevant, went through them all and found 304 that were clearly relevant to this question. We went through those to see what strategies have been proposed in scientific literature to deal with climate change. And there are all these sorts of things: transition towards renewable energy, reducing consumerism, energy consumption, improving energy efficiency, more sustainable transportation solutions, the built environment and materials, so things like increasing housing density, using more sustainable building materials, increased reflectivity of buildings, energy efficiency inside those buildings, wastewater usage and so on. Deforestation, reduction and management, certainly there's huge potential for previously agricultural land to be reforested, and when you have more diverse forests, they become maximally effective at being carbon sinks, and there's huge potential for those to be carbon sinks. Nature-based solutions have been proposed, things like preserving and encouraging things like seagrass beds, the growth of algae across the surface of the oceans, both of which can be used as carbon sinks. Attempts to geoengineer to do things like produce clouds and increase the reflectivity of parts of the earth to reflect solar radiation. Biotechnology, the attempts to produce supercarbon absorbing trees, biofertilizers, biopesticides, and in particular the need to change our food systems and the livestock sector in particular. The EGAR database is one of the best, the emissions database of global atmospheric research, providing data about greenhouse gas emitted by various sectors of society. And they've calculated that 34% of all greenhouse gases produced by people essentially come from the food system, if you look at all the different parts of the food system together. So clearly the food system is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gases. Fossil fuel production and consumption, of course, is bigger, but this would be not too far behind. If we could just consider the food system alone, without any change with the business as usual model that we're currently on, greenhouse gas emissions from the food system alone will cause us to breach that 1.5 degree limit. And on top of that, the food system emissions are not going to stay stable. They're actually increasing with global increase in human population, and 1/3 of the world actually developing. And as they develop, they get more disposable income and greatly increase their consumption of livestock products. So actually, the food system emissions are expected to increase by 50 to 92%. That's well illustrated by this infographic here. The emissions produced by the no change, business as usual model are indicated in the blue bar up here. That's the emissions that we would expect to see between now and the end of the century. In order for us to meet the 1.5 degree target, if we want to have a 2/3 chance of reaching that, we can only emit this many emissions from all sectors of society. If we want to have a 50% chance of meeting that target, we can emit a bit more emissions, but clearly in both cases, the emissions from the food system completely destroy any chance of us being able to stick to the 1.5 degree limit. If we accept a 2 degree rise above pre-industrial temperatures, then the emissions from the food system alone, not considering all the other sectors of society, also greatly threaten the chances of achieving a 2 degree increase above pre-industrial levels. So there you go. Mitigating the impacts of the agricultural sector are certainly being proposed and described in the scientific literature, and there are things like composting, conservation agriculture in order to try and increase carbon sequestration into the ground, essentially. Methods to try and increase the efficiency of food production, yield increases, crop waste reduction, food production changes and so on. And of course reduce consumption of animal products. The livestock sector, according to the various sources in the scientific literature, actually contributes between about 71 and 80% of all the greenhouse gas emissions produced by the agricultural sector. So the livestock sector actually accounts for about 25 to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and indeed 1/3 of all human-generated CO2 emissions so far. There have been lower estimates, but they fail to account for various aspects associated with the livestock sector, including particularly deforestation to produce feed crops for livestock animals. So it's certainly one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. The livestock sector contributes about 9% of all human-generated CO2, but contributes major proportions of some very powerful greenhouse gases. In particular, contributes 37% of all human-generated methane, which is a gas that has, as I said, 72 times the global warming potential of CO2, and that's primarily from enteric fermentation by ruminants. It also contributes about 65% of all human-generated nitrous oxide, which has an incredible 296 times the global warming effect of carbon dioxide. So clearly the livestock sector contributes major proportions of human-generated greenhouse gases, some of the most damaging ones, methane and nitrous oxides. Nitrous oxides come from manure produced by livestock animals. The livestock sector also contributes far more than plant-based food production to deforestation, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss and species extinctions, and consumes the vast majority of the global water footprint as well. There have been various strategies described to try to mitigate the impacts of the livestock sector, such as the use of various vaccines for ruminant animals to try to change the population of bacteria within the ruminants to have less methanogenic bacteria, genetic selection, dietary manipulation, better breeding, improved fertility, all aimed at trying to increase the efficiency of production of usable milk, meat by livestock animals. Better pasture management, regenerative grazing, fertiliser and irrigation. Bearing in mind a lot of those actually aren't available in vast regions of the world where people actually can't afford things like fertilisers. There might be pastoral livestock in rangelands and so on. Reduction in energy and water use and management of manure to try and capture nitrous oxides and other nitrogenous gases and manipulate manure so it produces less of it. So again, expensive and likely unavailable in large regions of the world, and certainly not in the time scale that we need. The most effective strategies would be a reduction in production and consumption of the least efficient food products, and that in particular is ruminant meat and milk. Beef is the least efficient protein. Greenhouse gas emissions per gram of beef protein is about 250 times that produced by plant protein on average. Emissions from ruminants such as cattle and sheep far outweigh those from fruit and vegetables under almost all scenarios. The only possible exceptions are when fruit and vegetables are transported by planes or produced in rice-flooded paddy fields. Eating meat generally consumes almost 4 times as much, contributes almost 4 times as much greenhouse gas emissions as a plant-based diet. And unfortunately, as I've said, because the human population is growing so rapidly, the production of meat and milk is rising to meet this increasing demand. It's not just the growth, it's also the development of the developing world, and as that happens, those people naturally want to adopt lifestyles that associate with the affluent West, which is much higher consumption of livestock products. So the meat industry is expected to expand 50 to 73% by the year 2050, and in fact global meat and dairy consumption is expected to double by 2070. So as I said, the impacts of the livestock sector, damaging though they are not staying stable. They're expected to go up very substantially under the business as usual model unless we make major changes. So the first report that really documented the adverse environmental impacts of the livestock sector and was widely reported around the world was Livestock's Long Shadow, which came out in 2006. And that was produced by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The lead author was Steinfeld, and he noted that because the production of livestock products are expected to double over that time frame, the environmental impact per unit of livestock production must be actually cut in half just to keep damage to the current stable levels. The various mitigation strategies that I just briefly mentioned often require technological innovation. They're relatively costly, they have limited availability around the world, and they're just not, and on top of all that, they can't achieve anything like the necessary reduction in level of impact per unit of product produced. Accordingly, the only strategy that has any realistic chance of bringing the impacts down to the sorts of levels that we need is dietary change. When accepting the Nobel Peace Prize for work in this area by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a Nobel Prize, in 2007, Dr. Pachauri, the head of the IPCC, called upon the world to please eat less meat. And of course, I think we need to add a call to please consume less dairy products as well, because of the very damaging impacts of dairy cattle. How much less meat and dairy should be consumed was actually studied by the Eat-Lancet group of 37 world-leading scientists who calculated what reduction levels were required to sustainably feed a future human population of 10 billion people within our planetary boundaries. And they looked at the current consumption levels of meat, milk and dairy eggs and so on within the EU, and calculated that massive reductions would be required in virtually all of those categories in order to achieve sustainable levels. Provage International has also calculated a fairly similar set of reductions that would be necessary as well. So really, to conclude, what would the benefits be of a vegetarian or vegan diet? It would lower greenhouse gas emissions by about 20 to 55% compared to a typical Western diet. Adoption of plant-based diet on a global scale would reduce demand for land by about 76%, about 49% reduction in foods, greenhouse gas emissions, reduce acidification by half, achieve a similar reduction in eutrophication, and a 19% reduction in freshwater withdrawals. So really big reductions in all these critical sustainability categories. Now, we're all vets, what can we actually do about this? Certainly, I would encourage everyone to think about, obviously, what you personally can do. It's one thing to just change our own diets, but as to really achieve the sort of social changes needed in this area, I would encourage people to think about how they can achieve wider social change as well. As vets, obviously, we can think about plant-based diets for cats and dogs as well, and that's the subject of my next talk later on this afternoon. I'll go into that in a little bit of detail. But I'd also ask people to think about using the platform that you have as veterinarians, your one of the most trusted and well-respected professions within society. You're expected to know something about livestock animals and livestock animal production. And when you speak about livestock animals, you can be expected to be trusted more broadly than most other sectors of society. Clearly, the livestock sector is one of the gravest threats to life on Earth because of its effects on deforestation and greenhouse gas production. And I do think vets need to be highlighting that and asking for the only realistic change that has a true prospect of being able to address this issue sufficiently, which is decreased consumption of livestock produce, particularly in the wealthy nations, which currently have a relative overconsumption of livestock produce compared to the global average. Thank you.
If we know reducing the consumption of meat will benefit the planet, why don't we just make it less available?
Well, there have been calls for that to be done through things like reducing the current very substantial subsidies of livestock production that occur within funding mechanisms within Europe and are being set up to replace those within the United Kingdom post-Brexit, and replace those public subsidies, so we're all effectively paying for part of the cost of this industry to exist, to replace those subsidies with taxes, actually, which would reflect the externalities of this industry, the true costs of this industry to not just all of us as impacts on our society in the future because of things like climate change, but also the impacts on the other living creatures with whom we share the planet as well, the impacts on animals who are increasingly threatened by deforestation and climate change. So an obvious way to do that is to replace those subsidies with taxes and also simply educate people about this stuff. As I say, I think it's the most important issue of our time and the generations that will come after us, the wholesale destruction of the other living species with whom we share the planet, and the threats indeed to our own species as well, ultimately. And it's partly because of climate change, and it's very much because of the livestock sector. So yeah, educate people as well. Thank you.
I get a lot of vet students message me, and I'm always unsure where to direct them, whether to try and have some inside people in agriculture or to go into a specific area of research or something different. Yeah, any thoughts you have on people starting now?
Yeah. Some people think it's a good idea to try to work within inside the livestock industry as livestock vets. I think, Alice, you're a fantastic example of somebody who has done that for a number of years and reached the conclusion, as I understand it, that sadly they're not really open to the realistic level of change that is really needed to address the systemic animal welfare problems within your work in the pig industry. And I understand that other vets become disillusioned in some other livestock industries as well. You can try that. I would encourage everyone to do what I've done and become a professional animal advocate if you can. And that means, I think, really thinking about becoming an animal welfare specialist, a veterinary specialist in animal welfare, pursuing postgraduate training qualifications, developing specialised knowledge about various areas, but not stopping there. The master's program I set up at the University of Winchester, a distance learning course on animal welfare, science, ethics and law, is very much not just for bookworms, for people who have an interest. It's all about communicating this to wider society and attempting to achieve policy and legislative change. So I think it's one thing to learn about it yourself and change your own diet, but we need so much more than that. And there is nobody out there really in society, other than rare exceptions, maybe people in charge of government, but general people, there's nobody that's got kind of the platform that we have as vets who can talk about livestock production and the power to be able to educate people with informed, evidence-based messages about these critical issues. So I'd say with that power comes great responsibility, and I'd ask again everyone to please think about doing more than just considering yourself. Think about finding ways to educate larger numbers of people about this important issue. Thank you.